All right, welcome back,
Hello, my
everyone.
name is Devin Bay. I'll be presenting accounting for multiscalar and conscious psychobiological phenomena in the active inference paradigm. So for an overview, I'm going to be going over the Markov blanket trick and then critiques of the Markov blanket and address how some of the previous work of Chris Fields and Friston partially addresses these critiques before finally going over problems of consciousness, new approaches and theories on consciousness and how these fit within the FEP and active inference, and then provide some ways to update the framework based on this information. I'm also going to take an epistemological perspective on modeling, and I'll focus on how both the conceptual and mathematical formalizations of superposition and entanglement can maybe alleviate some of the problems that are identified in the critiques. So, the Markov blanket, since we are on limited time here, I will assume that most of the people here are already familiar somewhat with the Markov blanket or active inference framework, but I'll give a brief overview of the Markov blanket, focusing on some of its mathematical frameworks as well as some of the assumptions implicit within the framework. So, for the mathematical overview, given a state S of a model, its Markov blanket is the set of sufficient states within the network needed to infer that state, and it essentially partitions autonomous and external states and is helpful in identifying which variables are conditionally independent from each other and expresses the joint probability between external and internal states as mediated by blanket states. So the assumptions here is that there's sparse coupling between the different states in the Markov in the overall system, and that there is somewhat of a delineation between external and internal states, and that these external internal states can be properly partitioned via the Markov blanket. So the implications here, the Markov blanket is metaphysically distinct from Pearl blankets, at least in the context of active inference or free energy principle. I think this was raised by Boonberg and his colleagues in the Markov in the Emperor's New Markov Blankets paper. And so this essentially means that um, they differentiate themselves from Pearl blankets by nature of their application, and the Friston blanket itself, by nature, takes on assumptions like the existence of external, internal, sensory, and active states. Um, and so this is the main sort of differentiation. Also, the Friston blanket is not providing a metaphysics, at least at least in my interpretation. And so we assume here the existence of distinct states which may be modeled, and this means that there are distinct states which are properly separable, and that there are either epistemological or ontological grounds for doing so. And so the main problem here, I think, is that there is not enough justification to argue that the the Markov blanket partitioning is an epistemological or in a more broader sense an ontological boundary, and that is causally correct, or it causally captures is able to causally capture causal relationships between variables, because the existence of sensory active and internal states and external states is something which can be disputed and which I'll discuss later on in this talk. And so another implication of the Markov blanket is that it allows the modeling of recursive structures and dynamics by use of the renormalization group, for example, which apparently allows the Markov blanket to capture multiscalar phenomenon. And finally, the question of whether the Markov blanket adheres to the Bayesian-Occam razor. It would simply depend on the choice of parameters for the specific model and does not inherently implicate the Markov blanket. So, Critiques of the Markov blanket. Like I mentioned earlier, the ontological critique of the Markov blanket is leveraged by both Brunberg and Raja in their respective papers, although as we've seen in responses to these papers, frankly it depends on the ontological interpretation of active inference and the free energy principle. And if, as Kieferstein in his response to Brunberg's paper claims, the Markov blanket should not be interpreted literally, then this problem partially goes away. However, the epistemological status of the Markov blanket is still under question, as raised in a part of Raja's paper, insofar as the explanatory power of the model is under some pressure. So chiefly there's a broader philosophical question about the purpose of models, and this is not necessarily unique to FEP or active inference or the Markov blanket, but nevertheless, since it affects all models, these issues are raised in the context of the Markov blanket as well. Next, we also see that there is a mathematical problem with the selection of Markov blanket states, because we see that for example, dynamic causal modeling in neuroscience does not demonstrate that that models provide scientists with a plausible account of the behavior of real-world biological systems, since successful applications of causal modeling does not give us any reason to believe that neural systems plausibly, for example, minimize free energy, or that they are ergodic active inference systems. And so this means that even though the model may be applied successfully and may predict some behavior successfully, it doesn't necessarily mean that the model is, number one, an accurate representation of what's ongoing with the internal dynamics of the system, and number two, that it would therefore be able to capture accurately all of the internal workings of the system. And so yes, and on this mathematical side as well, we also see that Yaron Ilan published in 2023 a paper on the constrained disorder principle and how that would possibly dictate neuronal function. And so Ilan points out that despite the stochasticity exhibited by the nervous system's operation, there's not necessarily a high level of control, since randomness at the lower levels never stops, and thus it dictates a paradigm of reaction, not action, by organisms. He uses the free energy principle, but does not use it to justify a form of active inference, which would be minimizing uncertainty, but rather argues that the constrained disorder principle is more preferable, where a process of balancing disorder and order is more inherent to systems operation in highly dynamic random environments. So whether all environments are highly dynamic and random, and at what scales this randomness can be asymptotically ignored, becomes irrelevant, is still up for question. However, the fact that these boundaries are not clear, and in fact that they arguably cannot be made clear, for example, via the existence of Maxwell's demon or limits on computability, etc., should point us in the direction of choosing better models and better parameters for these models. So what can this tell us about the free energy principle and the Markov blanket? First, it points to broader problems with the free energy principle, but these still carry over implications. These still carry implications for the ways in which the free energy principle epistemologically treats the Markov blanket, mainly to delineate across and between scales and causal relationships. In the later portion of this talk, I'll explain why entanglement and superposition are suitable replacements for the Markov blanket, where they actually offer a greater flexibility without constraining the mathematical and philosophical operations. And notably, Chris Field's paper on the FEP for generic quantum systems makes implicit use of some of the same affordances offered by superposition and entanglement, but takes a very specific interpretation of quantum systems, and I think limits the flexibility of such modeling tools by adhering to the holographic principle. Now on to the epistemological status of models, which I think is important to raise here because the question of whether the Markov blanket can accurately encompass multidirectional, what I'll call horizontal pathways, vertical and horizontal pathways, even without the presence of clear attractor states, is still under question, as is the more general assumption of ergodicity within the FEP framework. And so, as experimental evidence from physics shows, systems in general, not simply at macro or micro states, are afflicted by complex dynamics such as replica symmetry breaking, which fall into a sort of gray area between ergodicity and non-ergodicity, and thus render the determination of ergodicity versus non-ergodicity much more complicated, even with suggestions such as local ergodicity, as outlined by Ramstead in the 2018 article. So I think it's important to outline the epistemological status of models because it's important for clarifying whether the Markov blanket itself is problematic within the FEP framework and whether it can potentially be reworked. So from a Bayesian perspective, models should want to minimize both epistemic and aleatoric uncertainty, where epistemic uncertainty is the reducible part of the total uncertainty, and aleatoric uncertainty is basically the irreducible part. Active inference models, therefore, should minimize both epistemic and aleatoric uncertainty and represent possible model configurations and parameters via prior hypothesis space, where the choice of model is informed both by where we believe the quote-unquote truth is located, or at least the most truthful model is located, as well as the model constraints. So here we see in green is the ideal situation where we have an ideal selection of model with an ideal convergence to some truth X. And then the purple shows an example here where our prior hypothesis space does not accurately encompass the true model, and hence by extension the true model is not included in the posterior. Finally, the pink shows where the posterior does not converge to the true model. And so this is illustrating how problems can arise in these two areas. First, the hypothesis space does not properly encompass the true model X, which is the purple or blue example. And then second, the posterior space does not properly converge to the true model X, which is our pink example here. And so constraints on X depend on if you're a realist or an anti-realist. So for example, if you believe that there is some ground truth that is universal and unchanging, and it's physically accessible, then of course the true model would be a real true model. But if you're more of an anti-realist, then it would depend on your hypothesis space, and of course, whether you believe that truths can be accurately represented or even be accessed, and that they're universal or whatever. So yeah. Now the question is the Markov blanket the proper choice of parameter for the free energy principle in active inference? So the purpose of the Markov blanket is to provide a statistical boundary which delineates a system from its environment. It ensures that variables are conditionally independent that certain variables are conditionally independent of other variables in the network, and it formalizes the belief or the prior that the system and its environment are separate, either ontologically, epistemologically, physically, like literally, or even causally, right? So Colombo and Palacios actually indict the Markov blanket and FEP, active inference model, by saying that it achieves a maximal generality for minimal biological plausibility because these boundaries can be drawn sort of arbitrarily, and even the existence of cellular membranes, for example, does not necessarily constrain causal relations between or across scales. So notably, Noble argues that organisms are open systems that operate far from equilibrium. And so again, drawing from Noble's arguments, Elon, in the 2023 paper, argues that organisms develop numerous emergent boundaries between levels which are not present at the single cell level. So even though they may have distinct functional purposes, boundaries like the skin, intestinal tract, or even vastus medialis depend on exchanging matter and energy through cellular membranes. And so a boundary is thus dynamic, interactive, not passive, and cannot always be defined anatomically. So, for example, electrical gradients and ion concentration gradients are actively generated across cell membranes, where interactions across boundaries determine an organism's functions, not just the composition of the boundary or the genome. So, of course, one way this has been explored in the free energy principle and active inference is via this sort of recursive Markov blanket. But we see that this sort of recursive modeling is not able to properly capture multi-scalar relationships and interactions across and between boundaries, where essentially we would have, Markov blankets that are causally implicated in more than one way in more than one way that can be described by simply the repertoire of active, external, internal states, and sensory states. And so this is sort of where the case for entanglement comes into play, because entanglement has been argued for as a way of causally representing relationships between variables in biology. So first of all, we see that organizational boundaries of living systems are open and flexible, such that these boundaries need not be coextensive with the organism's bodily boundaries, number one. So again, I guess this is just to drive home the point that the Markov blanket should not be taken literally. But we also see that biology is inherently quantum. So these um, these processes of cellular differentiation, for example, are fundamentally underlied by, or sorry, fundamentally, determined by, or perhaps sort of controlled by quantum processes that dictate, what chemical bonds the cell is able to break, for example, or how certain concentrations of ions, for example, flow across the cellular membrane, and the permeability of the membrane as well can also exhibit quantum effects. So as the field of quantum biology grows, I think we will increasingly see that the quantum level is extremely important for dictating how organisms evolve, and especially if quantum consciousness theories continue to gain support, we could see that quantum processes may also be implicated in consciousness. And so causal entanglement addresses the sort of asymmetry between what were previously considered linear processes and this sort of asymmetry across and between scales. So I basically argued that causal entanglement is a counterintuitive form of Occam's razor, because when we have entangled variables, we don't need to always explicitly represent the dependencies of these variables with each other. So that means that we can, in an infinite dimensional Hilbert space or a finite dimensional Hilbert space, represent the variables in a way that does not necessarily dictate specific boundaries or constraints on these variables, which may impede the causal modeling of certain phenomena. So as the scale and complexity of the model increases, representing relationships via entanglement becomes much more appealing. And of course, quantum computing also offers ways to speed up the computation of machine learning models like an active inference. So Vecchi actually puts forward a case for causal entanglement using DNA, and essentially we see that that entanglement can serve as a form of sort of outlining the different causal dependencies in a system without necessarily explicating them, without putting too much emphasis on the specific properties of the causal relationships. If we know that causal certain things are are causally implicated, then we can take the sort of rough approach of assuming that they might be entangled to some degree. Um, and so basically entanglement can serve as a method for representing causal relationships by conflating correlation with causation. And so the in the paper, Vecchi uses chromatin structures during the interphase period of mitosis to show how and basically show how it can be characterized in terms of interactions between entities at three different levels of biological organization. So essentially, the parts or angles between the linkers, the in the chromatin, and then the chromatin structure or the topological invariant structure, and then finally the feedback loop between how the whole, which is the overall chromatin structure, depends on context properties in the feedback loop, for example, via histone deacetylation or histone methylation. And so essentially, we see that they argue that DNA is both a total and direct cause when being manipulated, where it is a total cause because DNA is implicated in its own manipulation, and it's also a direct cause because it's an intervention on DNA will change the functional or structural properties of the DNA without changing necessarily additional non-local properties of whatever substrate surrounds the DNA. And so specificity still allows linear models to capture causal relationships in terms of isolating specific variables, but when we increase the scale and complexity of these of the model, for example, or of what we include in the model, it becomes increasingly more difficult to separate out and to sort of distinguish, okay, where exactly does the specificity lie? And so this takes me to this differentiation between repertoire and connectedness when it comes to causal specificity. So repertoire is basically how many possibilities exist on each side, the cause side and the effect side. And we can essentially, in a modeling context, take this to mean the number of different values that an effect variable and a cause variable can take. Meanwhile, the connectedness is how the possibilities on both sides are connected in particular and relevant ways. So we can see, again, in the modeling context, that connectedness is a condition for a given function connecting the values of cause and effect variables. And so repertoire does not entail connectedness, and connectedness does not entail repertoire, which is important to note. Because essentially we see that repertoire but by splitting causal specificity into these two independent properties, we may not be able to compare causal relations from a single point of view, and therefore causal entanglement may allow for the comparison of both without necessarily giving up, one for the other. And of course, Ruse notes that you need both repertoire and connectedness in order to come to a complete causal understanding of, whatever processes are implicated or you're examining within the system. And so the form of entanglement between, repertoire and connectedness, would allow you to express both of them in the system simultaneously and potentially, extract results from either of them. And so, what are the practical constraints and limitations on this approach? Well, first of all, we might view it as a case similar to quantum versus classical computing, where as the complexity class of the problem increases, quantum computing becomes more appealing. So, utilizing entanglement may not be computationally feasible right now, given hardware constraints. And modeling using the entanglement may obfuscate the extraction of direct causal relationships. But as Noble has pointed out, and this previous researchers have pointed out, the extraction of direct causal relationships is a very difficult task, and epistemologically it's not clear whether this is even possible once the system surpasses a given point of complexity where where the dependencies between and across scales simply become too large to properly identify direct causal relationships. And so essentially, this entanglement approach may also become computationally infeasible when we have lots of dense variables that are not sparsely coupled. But I think because the Markov blanket also inherently relies on the sparse coupling, and sparse coupling in neuronal dynamics has been shown, entanglement can be taken as a sort of replacement for the Markov blanket. And so I'll just get into some previous work involving the free energy principle in quantum mechanics. So Chris Fields integrated quantum information theory with the free energy principle and proposed that physical interaction is a form of information exchange where the holographic principle can essentially be used to formalize boundaries between systems. Additionally, Worthier investigated the potential for tensor networks to represent generative active inference models. So tensor networks, of course, can offer computational benefits when run on quantum computers, and the tensor network itself was originally designed to be used in quantum mechanics. So specifically for Fields' approach with the quantum reference frames, we see it's a different way of approaching the Markov blanket, which still formalizes boundaries using the holographic principle. So it is still assuming that we can properly distinguish the boundaries between organisms and their environments, and that these boundaries are both causally necessary, right? So that there's some causal impact at the boundary that cannot be ignored, and that the boundary itself is properly distinguishable. So now I'll go into some theories of the overview of consciousness and how it's implicated in both FEP and active inference, and how it fits into the proposed framework for utilizing entanglement. So the minimal causal mechanisms of consciousness, we see that there are regions in the brain that are implicated in consciousness where, if these regions of the brain are damaged or not functioning properly, this leads to changes in the overall phenomenal and conscious perception of individuals. So we also see that non-equilibrium macroscopic brain dynamics are a robust signature of consciousness. So at some level, consciousness can, statistically and physically be proven to be the sort of higher order uh, um, process or dynamic that is going on in the brain. And so consciousness and the Markov blanket. So how does consciousness interact with the Markov blanket and the free energy principle? Does the link between phenomenal perception, judgment, awareness, observation, etc. disrupt the epistemological application of the Markov blanket? And do competing theories of consciousness pose problems for active inference? So on the first question, I think that when it comes to the Markov blanket and free energy principle, consciousness, you know, as I guess with all neuroscientific theories, is this sort of throws a wrench in things when we are trying to consider how, you know, conscious states or differing levels of conscious states may not be easily or neatly put into boxes of either internal or sensory states, because again you're assuming that the organism has either the organism itself has some capacity to differentiate between these states, and that the states themselves can be placed into this sort of into these sort of categories for representation by the Markov blanket. So I think this is especially apparent when we are discussing phenomenal perception, judgment, awareness, observation, etc., because these types of phenomena are very, very broad ranging in terms of their phenomenal activity and their corresponding their correspondence to underlying neuronal dynamics. And of course, the research there is still ongoing, but based on, you know, what research there is into awareness, for example, attention or observation, there seems to be varying sort of degrees of complexity and also degrees of causality when it comes to, you know, which areas of the brain are implicated in minimal self-awareness, and to what extent these boundaries initially observed can be modified, or, you know, modified either internally by the person, the observer, modified by some external causal force, for example, like anesthetics. And so the competing theories of consciousness, do competing theories of consciousness pose problems for active inference? And I would say it depends on the mechanism of consciousness, right? So it depends on how these theories lay out consciousness, because they may or may not implicate active inference. For example, theories which are more volitional, on the more volitional side, that attribute you know, consciousness to volitional activity, which in itself is maybe distinct from, you know, free energy minimizing or uncertainty minimizing activities, then we would see that that yes, these competing theories of consciousness do or would pose problems for active inference. And another dynamic that I want to explore here is the unconscious, right? So experimental evidence supports a sort of minimal unconscious, where we can broadly distinguish between type 1 and type 2 thinking. So type 1 thinking is unconscious processing, and type 2 thinking is conscious processing. And researchers have sort of found that there is a form of dynamic unconscious which sits between the sort of conscious processes that are, you know, directly under observation or awareness, and then those perhaps autonomic processes, for example, where they're entirely unconscious. And so the dynamic unconscious theory essentially posits that the observer or the conscious agent themselves has some capacity to guide their awareness to processes that were previously unconscious. So you can essentially make previously unconscious processes conscious. And again, the implications for the Markov blankets neat delineation between sensory, active, and internal states. I would say this sort of frustrates the the thinking behind the thinking behind trying to separate out these different states, right? And so theories of the brain should incorporate a transition from unconscious to conscious awareness. Um, and of course, this is extremely difficult because we don't have really a solid understanding of what consciousness even is, what are the minimal phenomenal sort of requisites of consciousness, and how sort of expansive the operations of the unconscious are, and whether those unconscious operations are therefore implicated in conscious processing as well, for example, with underlying cognitive biases. So, what are the implications for the free energy principle? So, both conscious and unconscious processes should be modeled. However, the distinction between sensory and internal states does not do these conscious and unconscious distinction. I think it doesn't do it justice. So, why is that the case? Well, first, conscious processes are sometimes unconscious processes are processes that may inherently be sort of semi-conscious. For example, when someone is scratching their leg, for example, right? The distinction between conscious and unconscious processes is one that is fundamentally dynamic, and therefore we don't know whether there even is a boundary between the awareness of scratching leg and not scratching leg, and especially if that boundary is sort of is highly dynamic. For example, when someone is slipping in and out of consciousness post anesthesia. And so we see that unconscious and conscious processes could influence active inference in ways that are particularly unique to them. So, for example, unconscious processes could be represented as as priors within the model, but that doesn't always necessarily have to be the case, because these unconscious processes could also be interacting as internal states, for example, or they could be present even as active states once they are made conscious. And so the mechanisms of consciousness, various theories which have been proposed, could provide a mathematical basis for expanding active inference and the free energy principle as well. So I think this is very important to note, because theories of consciousness, novel theories of consciousness that incorporate, more quantum information side, or that correspond to the the electrical correlates of consciousness, for example, um, are extremely important may provide mathematical frameworks for updating active inference, or potentially may provide useful mechanisms for modeling specific conscious processes that could then be incorporated into the framework of active inference. And so, let's see. And so, yeah, so I think I'm missing a few slides here, but basically, the overall theories and most promising theories of consciousness um, that that are upcoming are, the sort of the electrophysiological and the electrical field sort of theories of consciousness, which posit that consciousness is actually a result of the electrical dynamics in the brain, which of course would need to be a case as for any minimally causal sort of representation of consciousness. But the presence of electrical fields and the implication of these fields in consciousness is, a particularly new avenue of research. And we see that, for example, firing patterns in the brain have produced quasi-crystal representations, and can be represented as well in the torus, for example. So these higher dimensional dynamics within the brain correlating to consciousness, or these sort of unconscious processes will be extremely important in and determining, what processes are relevant for consciousness and how these might be implicated in inference, for example, or thought patterns, traversing whatever sort of dynamic landscape that exists in the brain, which again may be determined by these higher order or these higher magnitude or dimensional structures. So overall, we see that investigating the mechanisms of consciousness, I think, is fundamentally necessary for FEP and active inference, because these structure or have the potential to structure thought in the ways in which certain energy landscapes, for example, in the brain, are traversed or fundamentally interact with each other. And so the areas for future work here would be to unpack the philosophical dimensions of active inference, which would include implicit assumptions about intelligence, sapience, and sentience. So, for example, you could utilize Denison's conception of intelligence, which argues for a relationship between the model and the modeling. The model and the modeler, as a direct form of intelligence there. Or you could utilize Simondon's theory of individuation as a more productive method for explaining the boundaries and cellular differentiation, which I've critiqued previously. You could also utilize quantum computing to take advantage of quantum-specific algorithms and to investigate quantum biology with an increasing scrutiny, for example, and discover ways in which quantum biology is implicated in processes of consciousness, active inference, and in the brain. And so essentially, the overall theory here, when it comes to when it comes to when it comes to active inference and multi-scalar phenomena and consciousness, is that we can essentially, if we take that the boundaries between the system and these systems are not actually ontological or physically causally implicated, and we utilize the sort of causal entanglement to represent relationships between different parts of the system. Consciousness can be taken as a form of observation along specific, causal trajectories within the system that would essentially collapse the superposition of these entangled states, which would produce, specific outcomes. And so that's a very broad sort of method for integrating consciousness with, quantum phenomenon and entanglement. But I think that there are many other, there are different methods of integrating quantum mechanics with the paradigm of active inference, for example, that are distinct from the holographic principle and do not rely on the explicit representation and encoding of information in the boundaries, for example. And when it comes to, for example, these unconscious processes, as I've outlined in the abstract, these unconscious processes could be represented more so by the minimization of uncertainty via the free energy principle as always ongoing processes, similar to Elon's argument, whereas conscious and more volitional actions would be represented by sort of observation on this quantum system where we are collapsing the superposition of specific entangled states. And so I think that in that way, entanglement offers two sort of benefits to the active inference paradigm. The first is that it allows for some flexibility when we are talking about different variables and causal connections between and across scales, because we can entangle two variables that are causally distinct. That are distinct across scales, for example, but which may be implicated in some feedback loop, for example. And this entanglement can then represent the causal dependencies between these variables. On the other hand, if consciousness, is a sort of quantum process, then it would allow for the integration of whatever quantum processes that are ongoing in whatever quantum consciousness. So if you believe that consciousness collapses the wave function, for example, then incorporating entanglement would be a mathematically feasible technique for incorporating this form of volition, where essentially the conscious agent is collapsing a specific wave function, and that leads to that allows them to perform active inference, for example, by minimizing specific probability densities. So yeah, that's overall the scope of my talk today. And yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed that. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Devin. Great times. So, I'll ask one question. You'll give the closing word for the live streams for the whole symposium. So, you're the only undergrad presenter. What would you say excited you to get into the game? And what do you say to younger learners to come?
I am mainly interested in uh, the sort of mathematical and philosophical, um, I guess, ideas behind active inference. And I'm particularly happy to see that the active inference ecosystem has, thriving philosophical and mathematical community. Um, so when it comes to um, younger um, participants who may be interested in active inference, I would say, keep pursuing what you're interested in, and if you have any particular areas of research or ideas, you should always be looking to share them, I think, and be looking to expand your horizons. So yeah.
Cool. Well, looking forward to hearing more from you and from others. So, thanks again, Devin, for bringing so much together in this last capstone talk.
Thank you so much for inviting me to give the talk, and apologies. I was a little bit short on time to put together the slides, so this was a lot messier than I would have liked, unfortunately. But yeah.
Real life is like that. All right. Thanks, Devin. Peace.
Thank you so much.